Next up, we have our next speaker. And again, this is for the conference. So all of our attendees are outside on break right now, and you all are the only ones that are able to be able to enjoy this content. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Joe Comps. I'm a cyber threat analyst over at Valley Cyber.
Nice. And your talk today was on Essex, correct?
ESXi. Yep.
Essex, sorry.
Yeah.
So we have all of the the
I know.
short, let's call it one. I'm also notorious for making up words. So
okay.
I'll call
keep up with.
Lululemon, Lululemon for some reason, and
that's got a better flair to it.
It's got way better flair,
but
it's also not realistic. Not real.
True.
When I say it, people don't know what I'm talking about. This happens all the time with acronyms. So we also we have a joke where we call it catisms.
Oh boy. Well, you're in the industry for acronyms, so
we are in the industry for acronyms. So I have 3 questions I've been asking every speaker. So first one is, what is your favorite, not technique, but sub-technique?
I did my homework. I heard this question was coming. So I'm going to have to say sub-technique, keeping on brand with my talk, would be the malicious VIBs, the vSphere installation bundles.
Those are pretty good.
My favorite, yeah.
But why?
Because it's one of the newest techniques, or sub-techniques, I should say.
So because it's new, it's shiny new?
It's new, it's relevant, and, it's kind of near and dear to our heart. Over at Valley Cyber, because that's exactly the kind of stuff that we do is, messing around with VIBs and doing stuff with ESXi.
That makes sense. All right, next one. Okay. And this is probably the most important question of the day.
Okay.
What is your favorite hacker snack?
Ooh, I think those Nature Valley bars that you guys had over there.
Really? That's your favorite?
I don't snack very often. I don't know.
You must have some self-will.
Well, it depends on who you ask.
That's fair. All right. The last one.
Okay.
So in this community, especially, we have a lot of newer people that usually attend or that'll watch these conferences. Mm-hmm. So my thought of asking this question is, how do you feel connected to the community? How could someone that doesn't feel connected, or if you're reconnecting, what do you do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm pretty new to the community myself, so I've kind of explored a bunch of different paths.
Perfect. You're perfect person.
Yeah, you picked the right one. I will say a lot of the cliche answers do kind of hold true in terms of local meetups or finding groups, whether it's a local defenders group, or if you're on the red team side, there's local DEF CON groups, or kind of the older hacker culture of the 2600 groups, things like that. It's a great way, because especially now it seems like everything is very, almost everyone's working remote for the most part. At least that seems to be the way the industry is going. So finding a way to actually get that face-to-face time with people, connect, share ideas. You never really know who you'll run into or the things that they'll be able to teach you. So I'm a big proponent of local meetups. That's always a lot of fun for me. I try to do those very often.
Have you noticed that with remote, there's a whole lot more collaboration? There's a lot of push for people coming back. And what are your thoughts on that? The whole back in the office versus remote thing. Do you think that's actually going to stay that way?
It's a good question. I think especially if you have a security clearance, that's kind of an inevitability. You're going back in the office. But I think the main driver is that connection to the people more than anything.
Yeah.
So if you can find ways to kind of, satisfy that desire to talk to people and get that face-to-face time outside of the office, then who knows? Maybe we'll all stay remote.
Yeah, I know for me, with our team, because I'm fully remote in Denver.
Oh, okay.
So I refuse to go back here.
Yeah.
McLean's nice and all, but it's not
it's not Denver.
It's not Denver.
Yeah.
I can't go on top of a mountain within an hour.
Right.
It's a thing. So what I found is I'll do little things. We'll have our little those, I don't know if you ever done this. It's where it's a working session where you're both awkwardly silent most of the time, but then you'll randomly talk to each other.
Yep.
It's a great way. It's like working in the same office with someone.
Yeah. Yeah, we do that periodically at Valley Cyber. My coworker Nathan and I will maybe jump on a call, and it'll be a while before we talk to each other. But yeah, it reminds me of CTF days when we used to do stuff like that too. You have everyone on the same Discord channel or something.
Yes, like that, so. CTFs. That's a great way to feel connected as well.
Yes,
and skill up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, big proponent of those too.
So, sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say there's no shortage of different things you can do, whether it's the CTFs or just the like I said, Discord channels or meetups, or even have a movie night with people over Discord or something.
DEF CON does that. They have movie nights.
Yeah, we do those periodically, and they're a good time.
So is there anything in your talk that, because I know we haven't talked about, I haven't had a chance to check your Slack channel. I don't see any questions though. is there anything that you talked that you kind of wanted to be able to like elaborate on or catch right now, or any questions that you wanted to address a little bit more from the audience that you had?
Yeah, I think I did I did run through the defenses portion of it a bit quickly, but thankfully, the speaker after me did such a good job of encompassing the defense. It's almost like we collaborated on that
I
one.
love
So
it.
yeah, we were just chatting about it. But no, I think like there's no shortage of techniques and things you can do to really like do a better job of protecting your environment. Implementing things like SSHMFA, or like implementing a runtime solution, like the one we offered Valley Cyber. Like those are really great ways to kind of shore up that hypervisor environment that you have.
Well, thank you so much for the time of the research, the talk, and coming here and hanging out with us on the couch.
Yeah, thank
I
you so
really
much. It's been
appreciate it.
fun.